You've probably noticed that sometimes life doesn't fall apart. You simply lose your rhythm. The world tries to convince you that you're lost, broken, or directionless, but that's a comfortable lie. The truth, raw and unapologetic, is that you're not lacking a path. You're lacking self-discipline. And that's the best news possible, because discipline doesn't depend on luck, money, talent, or approval. It depends solely on you, and on what you decide to do after this exact moment. What's most counterintuitive is that most people aren't failing because they're incapable, but because they lack the mental clarity to see their own patterns. You're not weak, you're distracted. You're not directionless, you're disconnected from the choices that actually matter. The world trained you to believe that control is luck, but control is construction. And when you understand that, a deep identity shift begins to take place inside you, almost without you noticing. The pain you feel today isn't lack of potential. It's lack of consistent action. And this is a pain that has a cure, because it responds quickly to the right movement. When you take a step, even a small one, life responds. Each microaction gives you back a little of your inner control, and you realize you don't need to wait for motivation. You create motivation. That's why this audiobook will make you uncomfortable, and it will also set you free. Here, you'll discover that discipline is not punishment, it's raw power. It's not limitation, it's freedom. It's not weight, it's direction. And throughout this journey, you'll see that every area of your life, emotional, physical, financial, mental, depends on small choices repeated at the right time. Choices anyone can make, but very few actually do. And that's exactly why living with discipline puts you at the top of a game almost no one is willing to play. Get ready, because what comes next isn't temporary motivation. It's structural transformation. You won't leave this audiobook lighter. You'll leave it stronger. You won't walk away deluded. You'll walk away aware. And when awareness enters, excuses leave. This is where everything begins, with the courage to face the truth. And the truth is simple. You're not lost. You never were. Now it's time to prove it in practice. He always believed his life was slipping through his fingers, as if something invisible were sabotaging his steps. But when he looked closely, what was missing wasn't power. It was self-discipline. It's interesting how the mind creates dramatic stories, making everything seem lost when, in reality, all that's missing is a clear route. That moment of mental clarity changes everything, because it reveals that the problem was never incapacity. It was simply the absence of consistent action, that daily impulse that brings direction to chaos. And when he realizes this, he begins to see that inner control is the true force that was always there. Many people think they are out of control just because they failed a few times. It's a narrative repeated so often that it sounds true. But when we honestly analyze it, we see it was only a temporary distancing from discipline. This awareness is liberating because it shows that nothing is broken, just misaligned. Identity shift happens exactly when the person accepts this fact without drama. It's like adjusting a compass. It always worked. It was just pointing in the wrong direction. A wise mentor knows that much of human suffering comes from expectations. He sees people expecting huge results without aligning even the smallest actions, believing that motivation is an eternal fuel. But motivation evaporates. Self-discipline remains. The person who understands this gains a mental clarity that cuts through the fog of excuses. And when they perceive that small habits can redefine their entire life, the spark of inner control starts rising again. This is the first step in reshaping their own story. He explains that the feeling of being lost is, in most cases, just a lack of structure. Nothing mystical, nothing complex. It's the absence of consistent action that creates the void. When the individual establishes even a simple routine, a new version of themselves begins to emerge without needing heroic effort. It's almost like watching a quiet identity shift happening in daily life. And it becomes clear that their power wasn't hidden. It was just disorganized. Sometimes he uses practical examples. If someone wants to improve their financial life, but never tracks expenses, it's natural for them to feel out of control. But using a simple app like Notion or Mobiles is enough to start developing inner control. Discipline is born from small decisions, not drastic changes. When a person understands this, their mental clarity grows because they can visualize progress. And progress, even small, creates consistent action. This destroys the illusion of being lost. The mentor jokes that if someone wants to improve but repeats the same habits every day, it's like expecting weight loss while eating cake daily. Light humor, but deeply true. He shows that self-discipline is not punishment, it's direction. It's impossible to have mental clarity without adjusting behaviors. When he explains this, many people realize that what they called bad luck was simply disorganization. And with this new understanding, the first movement of identity shift occurs naturally. In some moments, he suggests simple readings that shift mentality, such as The Power of Habit or Atomic Habits. These books expand mental clarity about human behavior. He knows that anyone who consumes this type of content starts feeling more inner control because they now understand how the mind works. And with understanding, consistent action becomes easier, no longer relying on motivation. Reading one page a day is already self-discipline. It's the small transforming the large. He also explains that people don't lose control of their lives overnight. What happens is a sequence of micro-abandonments. Every, "I'll do it later," chips away a bit of inner strength. But just as decline is gradual, ascension is too. And it begins with honest, small, consistent action. This process awakens mental clarity because it shows that nothing is impossible when you master the basics. And mastering the basics is the beginning of true identity shift. The mentor often says that discipline is not about living tightly, but living aligned. Whoever practices self-discipline discovers that life flows with less friction. Decisions become lighter. The mind gains space. The body responds. This state creates a kind of inner control that once seemed unreachable. And it's in this turning point that the person understands. They were never lost. They were simply disconnected from their own choices. A simple, yet profound click. He ends this teaching by leaving in the air a feeling that something bigger is coming next. After someone understands they're not out of control, just undisciplined, space opens for an even more powerful truth. It's as if the door has been unlocked. Now it just needs to be pushed. And in the next step, he shows exactly how discipline creates control, and why this changes absolutely everything on the path of transformation. Discipline creates control because it acts like the steering wheel that guides any path a person chooses to follow. And the mentor always explains that inner chaos exists only when there is not enough self-discipline to hold that will firmly. He describes that when someone follows small routines, the brain begins to experience more mental clarity, as if the inner clouds start to dissipate and reveal a deeper meaning behind each choice. This generates that slow, almost invisible identity shift that transforms everything around. And as the person notices that consistent action produces small advancements, inner control naturally blooms, without needing brute force or exhausting motivational speeches. He loves using real examples. Someone who feels anxious about their life, but never structured their mornings. All it took was creating a simple ritual. Waking up, making the bed, drinking water, walking for 10 minutes, and suddenly everything changed. The person began to feel more self-discipline because they were finally fulfilling promises made to themselves. That sensation generates mental clarity, as if life were getting back on track. And this simple change awakens the initial identity shift that shifts internal energy. From then on, consistent action stops being effort and becomes rhythm. And rhythm, inevitably, becomes inner control. The mentor always comments that society tries to convince people that control is luck, privilege, or circumstance, when in truth, it is nothing more than discipline applied intentionally. He says that anyone who chooses even a minimal structure is already 10 steps ahead of the majority. A basic daily checklist can transform chaos into direction, and that is not an exaggeration. The presence of self-discipline reorganizes even emotional confusion, because it gives the brain something solid to follow. And every small victory clears the mental fog, bringing mental clarity. Gradually, identity shift becomes inevitable, until the person realizes that consistent action creates order where there was only disorder, and order generates inner control. He explains that discipline doesn't appear suddenly, it is cultivated. It's a nearly handcrafted process where repetition is the tool and tolerance for discomfort is the ink. Those who understand this stop waiting for inspiration and start building consistent action like a trainable muscle. That's why self-discipline becomes a kind of superpower, something that makes everything feel more possible when it's present. The mentor points out that this superpower illuminates the mind, producing mental clarity even on difficult days, because there is now structure, and that structure pushes the old identity away, making room for a strong identity shift. Over time, inner control becomes a consequence rather than an effort. He also uses simple metaphors, saying that discipline is like putting a frame around a blurry photo. Suddenly, the image gains definition. People who react constantly to the world don't realize how much this frame is missing. But when they create routines, the inner universe seems to reorganize itself. Self-discipline becomes the rail, and thoughts move along it. That creates mental clarity, because it removes excess and highlights what matters. The old, lost identity begins to fade, making space for the identity shift. And each aligned decision becomes consistent action. In the end, what once felt like confusion becomes pure inner control. He enjoys provoking people. If discipline were a prison, why do the most disciplined people live the freest lives? This simple question dismantles limiting beliefs. He shows that freedom without direction becomes self-sabotage. Freedom with self-discipline becomes power. When someone organizes themselves, their internal world calms, and that calm produces mental clarity. Suddenly, they stop fighting themselves. They start acting instead of reacting. This movement triggers a fast identity shift. And with consistent action, control stops being fantasy and becomes a daily practice. At that moment, inner control becomes just a logical consequence. He uses simple examples, like reading 5 pages a day. 5 pages may seem small, but over a month, that becomes 150 pages, enough to finish a book that once felt impossible. This strengthens self-discipline because consistency is required. And when the brain gets used to small rituals, mental clarity appears naturally, opening the door to more positive content. Over time, the identity shift occurs because the person starts seeing themselves as someone who learns. And when they realize consistent action generates constant progress, their inner control grows. That is how discipline creates control, through the accumulation of small daily proofs of commitment. He also explains that action creates direction. Even when a person doesn't know exactly where they want to go, acting provides new information. It's like walking through fog. Each step reveals the next meter. This daily revelation strengthens self-discipline because it shows visible progress. And that vision produces mental clarity, helping adjust the route. The identity shift is noticeable when the person stops waiting and starts pursuing. That pursuit becomes consistent action. And with that, inner control solidifies because doubts no longer dominate. And he ends by making it clear that if controlling your life depends on discipline, then understanding how discipline works is the natural step for anyone wanting more power. This understanding opens an obvious, almost inevitable path. Because when someone realizes control is born from structure, not from luck, the mind instinctively begins craving the next step. And in a way, this prepares the perfect foundation for the next lesson, the one about seeing internal patterns before trying to change anything. He always says that no one can change what they cannot see. And that's why awareness is the first real step in any transformation. Many people think they're failing because they lack strength, when in reality, they simply lack the mental clarity to perceive their own patterns. The mentor explains that the human mind works like a very efficient autopilot, sometimes too efficient, repeating cycles without the person even noticing. And it's exactly this lack of perception that makes self-discipline seem impossible. But when someone decides to observe themselves honestly, identity shift begins moving quietly. This opens space for consistent action, because now the person understands where their behaviors actually come from, and that awakens an inner control that never existed before. He often explains that unconscious habits are like small leaks. They seem irrelevant until the house is flooded. Someone says, "I don't know why my life isn't moving." But they repeat self-sabotaging routines every single day. They wake up late, procrastinate, make impulsive decisions. Without mental clarity, the person doesn't realize that the problem isn't lack of time, it's lack of direction. And when this understanding arrives, self-discipline stops being emotional punishment and becomes a liberation tool. This initial shock is the beginning of identity shift. And as the person begins adjusting their choices, consistent action strengthens. That's how inner control is born, from awareness, not force. The mentor uses simple, powerful examples, like asking someone to record everything they do for 2 days. It sounds silly, but the exercise reveals harsh truths. The person realizes they spend hours scrolling, eating without hunger, avoiding important decisions out of fear. This act instantly generates mental clarity. When they see this reality, they understand that self-discipline isn't difficult. Living on autopilot is what's hard. That initial realization is the start of identity shift. And as they begin adjusting their behavior, consistent action becomes easier. This cycle strengthens inner control naturally. He also explains how the mind creates illusions to keep people in their comfort zone. Individuals justify everything. I deserve to rest. I work better under pressure. I'll start tomorrow. These sentences sound reasonable but hide repetitive avoidance patterns. When someone develops mental clarity, these excuses lose their charm and reveal their true purpose, keeping the person away from progress. The mentor reminds them that self-discipline only exists when one stops negotiating with their own excuses. This internal change produces an identity shift that transforms the way they see themselves. And with this shift, consistent action stops being a fight and becomes a conscious choice. Inner control appears naturally. He loves using metaphors, saying that awareness is like turning on a light in a messy room. In the dark, everything seems terrifying, but when the light comes on, the mess is just a mess, nothing more. The person realizes they weren't lost, they were just internally disorganized. This light is the mental clarity most people never seek. When it turns on, self-discipline enters as the broom that reorganizes everything. Identity shift happens when the person realizes they are in charge of their own mess. And when they assume the role of organizer of their mind, consistent action becomes inevitable. This internal organization brings inner control to life. He encourages people to practice simple self-observation, like asking themselves, "Why am I doing this right now?" This question breaks the autopilot. Suddenly, the person realizes they were eating out of anxiety, not hunger, or delaying tasks out of fear, not exhaustion. This understanding creates immediate mental clarity. From there, self-discipline has a real foundation, because now action is based on understanding rather than blind effort. Identity shift occurs when the person sees they can choose differently. And when those choices are repeated, they become consistent action. This cycle builds inner control over time. He also suggests practical habits, like 5 minutes of mindfulness or keeping a small thought journal. Writing even a few lines clarifies the mind and exposes hidden patterns. This writing brings a mental clarity that many have never experienced. With this clarity, self-discipline stops being overwhelming and becomes the result of comprehension. This marks the birth of identity shift, which strengthens as the person understands themselves better. And that understanding produces more conscious, consistent action. Inner control grows naturally from there. Another point he emphasizes is that awareness eliminates guilt. The person realizes they aren't weak, they were simply unaware. This relief creates space for self-discipline to grow without emotional weight. As they understand their patterns, mental clarity reduces emotional chaos. Identity shift becomes natural rather than forced. And with this new emotional balance, consistent action stops being blocked by internal conflict. Slowly, inner control replaces old confusion. He reminds them that awareness doesn't mean perfection, it means perception. No one becomes flawless overnight, but every day someone can become more lucid. And that lucidity is the root of true self-discipline. Each layer of mental clarity reveals a new area that can be transformed. Identity shift happens when the person chooses to act based on that lucidity. And each action becomes consistent action when repeated. That's when inner control begins shaping the new identity. And while he explains all this, he subtly hints that awareness is only the first pillar. Once someone learns to see their patterns clearly, they discover that the next step is even more powerful, accepting those truths without punishment. And that acceptance is exactly what opens the door for the next level of transformation, which he begins revealing in the next topic. He always says that acceptance isn't about giving up. It's about seeing yourself with honesty, like wiping steam off a fogged mirror so you can finally see your own face. Many people notice their patterns, but drown themselves in guilt, shame, and regret, suffocating self-discipline before it even begins. He explains that acceptance doesn't mean liking what you see. It means admitting it exists with mental clarity. From that point on, identity shift begins to take shape, because the person is no longer running from their own truth. They start acting with more consistent action, not out of pressure, but out of awareness. And this quiet movement awakens the beginning of inner control. The mentor always reinforces that blaming yourself for the past only creates more paralysis. Guilt is too heavy to carry while trying to build a new life. He says regret becomes an emotional pit where self-discipline drains away and disappears. But when a person accepts that they did the best they could with the understanding they had, something powerful happens. Mental clarity begins to shine again, revealing paths that were previously hidden. That clarity gives rise to an identity shift grounded in self-compassion. And with that, consistent action is no longer blocked by negative emotions. Slowly, inner control returns to their hands. He loves giving simple examples, like someone trying to lose weight, who destroys themselves emotionally after slipping for one day. That person forgets that a single slip changes nothing. The problem is not making mistakes, but giving up because of the mistake. He explains that acceptance means saying, "I messed up, that's okay, now I continue." This type of mental clarity makes self-discipline more stable, because it's based on maturity rather than emotional violence. When the person understands this, they experience an immediate identity shift, like a mental unlock. That shift strengthens consistent action, and through that continuity, inner control grows stronger. He also speaks about how the human mind loves creating dramatic narratives to justify quitting. Things like, "Since I failed today, I'll fail all week." He calls this the all or nothing effect and says it's the graveyard of results. When someone learns to accept small stumbles, they remove this mental rigidity. That flexibility produces powerful mental clarity. Self-discipline stops being a self-imposed punishment and becomes a tool for construction. Identity shift occurs when the person stops believing the lie that they're incapable. And with that new belief, consistent action increases. Inner control appears when the ego quiets down and awareness takes the lead. He often uses gentle metaphors, saying that acceptance is like making peace with the older version of yourself, the one who tried, failed, learned, and kept going. There's no point fighting a person who no longer exists. When someone accepts this, they create mental space for self-discipline to grow authentically. This lightness brings mental clarity, removing emotional weight. Identity shift occurs because they begin to see themselves as someone who evolves, not someone who fails. That view strengthens consistent action, making everything more achievable. And as that lightness becomes habit, inner control develops naturally. He encourages the person to stop replaying what they did wrong and start replaying what they learned. He says regret without learning is useless suffering, but regret with acceptance becomes wisdom. And this wisdom feeds self-discipline, because now the person acts with intention rather than fear. This process unlocks mental clarity, illuminating the present and the next steps. Identity shift becomes visible when the person starts treating themselves with more respect. That respect strengthens consistent action, and as it grows, so does inner control. He suggests writing a letter to their past self, thanking them for the attempts, the errors, and the lessons. This act reconciles internal conflicts. By doing so, the person feels self-discipline emerging more naturally, because emotional resistance decreases. Mental clarity increases because now they understand they are no longer fighting themselves. Identity shift begins through this inner reconciliation. And with that, consistent action is no longer sabotaged. This internal peace strengthens inner control like an emotional muscle. He reminds them that acceptance is not the same as complacency. Accepting doesn't mean saying, "This is how I am," but rather, "This is how I am right now, but it won't stay this way." That sentence changes everything. It brings a mental clarity that cuts through laziness, fear, and drama. It frees self-discipline to act without emotional burden. When the person thinks like this, identity shift is almost instant, because they begin seeing themselves as someone capable of change. That mindset fuels consistent action, guided by purpose rather than desperation. And that purpose generates a solid inner control. He also speaks about internal forgiveness. He explains that many people carry anger toward themselves, and that anger becomes a silent internal saboteur. When someone forgives themselves, self-discipline flourishes, because it is no longer crushed by guilt. Mental clarity grows because the mind is no longer consumed by self-criticism. This forgiveness produces a mature identity shift, and that maturity strengthens consistent action. In the end, inner control emerges as a return to the mind's natural balance. And at the end of this explanation, he always leaves unspoken the idea that accepting the truth is what allows transformation to happen. Because once someone accepts their reality without drama, the next step becomes inevitable, taking action. And that is exactly what he begins developing in the next topic, where potential becomes power. He always says that potential without action is worth absolutely nothing, and that many people spend their lives believing that one day it will happen, as if the universe owes them something. But the mentor explains that nothing changes until someone breaks inertia with self-discipline, even if the step is small, painful, or uncomfortable. He reinforces that action is what transforms mental clarity into real results, because clarity without movement becomes fantasy. The moment a person acts, even imperfectly, identity shift begins to appear, as if a new version of them rises from the ground, and each repeated step becomes consistent action, which sooner or later awakens the inner control they've always needed. He shows that most people don't fail from lack of ability, but from excess waiting. They wait for motivation, wait for courage, wait for the right moment. He jokes that anyone waiting for the perfect moment is waiting for something that doesn't exist. That's why self-discipline must come first, even before inspiration. When the person acts without wanting to, a different type of energy appears, creating mental clarity because now there's movement. That movement triggers a powerful identity shift, showing them they're someone who does, not someone who only dreams. And as they repeat it, consistent action becomes natural. From that pattern, inner control is born. He constantly uses practical examples, like someone who wants to learn English. They think, plan, get excited, but never start. He says, 5 minutes a day already puts you ahead of 99% of people. And it's true. Self-discipline grows from these micro-commitments, not from giant goals. When the person understands this, their mental clarity grows because they finally see real progress. Soon after comes the identity shift. They begin seeing themselves as someone who studies, learns, and grows. Over time, those 5 minutes become consistent action, and that consistency awakens inner control that once felt out of reach. He also likes illustrating with stories of people who wait for the right energy to work out, when in reality, the energy comes after the workout. He shows that action is the fuel, not the result. When someone gets moving, both body and mind respond. That response strengthens self-discipline and increases mental clarity, creating a virtuous cycle. The old identity, lazy, insecure, distracted, begins to lose power. That's how identity shift naturally occurs. And when the person realizes that small actions generate strong positive feelings, consistent action settles in. Inner control then appears as a side effect of practice. He provokes by saying that people never hesitate before choosing comfort, but hesitate endlessly before choosing action. This reveals how the mind is addicted to instant relief. Therefore, he teaches that self-discipline is not about being harsh. It's about being loyal to what you want to build. That loyalty produces deep mental clarity because it aligns intention with behavior. From that alignment, identity shift emerges almost automatically because the person starts seeing themselves as someone committed. With repetition, consistent action forms. And when that becomes natural, inner control grows steadily. He recommends practicing the 2-minute rule. If something takes 2 minutes or less, do it now. The rule is simple but is one of the most efficient gateways to self-discipline. By applying it, the person unlocks overwhelming mental clarity because small executions remove massive emotional backlog. This quick victory generates a mini identity shift, showing the person they can act immediately. With repetition, this becomes consistent action, and inner control becomes a natural consequence of this behavior. He also suggests practical financial actions, like investing small monthly amounts. He explains that it's not about the value, but the discipline behind it. Investing even 20 reais monthly in something simple like an ETF builds habit. This practice puts self-discipline into action and brings mental clarity about money. When they see growth, even tiny, a financial identity shift happens. They start seeing themselves as someone who builds wealth. That new identity fuels consistent action, and inner control grows in their financial life. The mentor reminds them that action destroys fear. When someone acts, they discover that most of the monsters they imagined never existed. The self-discipline born from facing fears gives them a sense of power that no thought alone can generate. That power brings mental clarity, eliminating doubts that lived only in imagination. And this creates a courageous identity shift. Repeating this cycle becomes consistent action, and from that, a strong inner control develops. He also explains that action creates direction. Even if the person doesn't know the final destination, acting reveals the next step. It's like walking in fog. Each step reveals the next meter. This revelation strengthens self-discipline because it shows visible progress. That visibility creates mental clarity and helps refine the path. Identity shift becomes clear when the person stops waiting and begins chasing. This pursuit becomes consistent action, and that rhythm solidifies inner control as doubts lose their power. And in the end, the mentor leaves a subtle message. Action is what changes everything. But acting alone is not enough. Not if the environment works against you. That's why the next step is understanding that willpower alone cannot overcome a sabotaging environment. Disciplined people create systems that make action almost inevitable. He always explains that relying solely on willpower is like trying to row against the current using a spoon. No matter how determined someone is, the human mind gets tired, distracted, and self-sabotages when overloaded. That's why disciplined people create systems, structures that make the right behavior easier and the wrong behavior harder. These systems strengthen self-discipline without requiring unnecessary effort. And when that happens, the person experiences a level of mental clarity most people never reach. The mentor always says that the environment wins against willpower almost every time. He comments that if someone wants to eat better, the simplest start is to stop buying what sabotages their diet. It sounds basic, and it is. Creating food systems, such as leaving fruit washed and ready in the fridge, strengthens self-discipline without suffering. This organization generates mental clarity because it reduces unnecessary choices, and this creates an identity shift that changes how the person sees themselves. He also shows how systems turn exhausting tasks into automatic actions. Leaving workout clothes ready the night before is a simple system that saves mental energy. It makes the person exercise even without motivation because the path is already prepared. That ease increases self-discipline by reducing friction. The mind gains mental clarity because there are fewer decisions to make. And this pattern feeds natural consistent action, strengthening inner control without force. He teaches that systems are intelligent shortcuts. A study system can be as simple as having a fixed schedule, studying at the same time every day. This predictability removes internal pressure and strengthens self-discipline. Over time, the person notices their mental clarity improves because their life now has order. That order builds a powerful identity shift, proving they can learn anything. And repeating the process becomes consistent action. From that consistency, inner control grows. The mentor highlights that systems can save someone's financial life. Automating investments, even small monthly amounts, into something simple like IVB11 or BOVA11, eliminates the temptation to spend impulsively. This builds self-discipline without emotional strain and brings mental clarity about money. The person starts seeing themselves as someone who builds wealth, initiating a financial identity shift. With time, this becomes consistent action. That consistency produces a stable, growing inner control. He explains that systems remove decisions from emotions' hands and place them into strategies' hands. If someone has a pre-made workout plan, they don't need to think about what to do. They just follow it. This simplicity strengthens self-discipline daily. The mind becomes lighter, gaining mental clarity for more important areas. This mental lightness ignites an identity shift, and each completed action reinforces consistent action and shapes stronger inner control. He says systems protect people from themselves. When someone is tired, sad, or unfocused, the system keeps them on track. This removes internal pressure and sustains self-discipline during bad days. The system creates emotional mental clarity that prevents sudden collapses. The stability reinforces the identity shift already in motion, and the consistency of these systems turns into consistent action. At the end, inner control grows without drama. He encourages creating mental organization systems too, like priority lists and weekly reviews. These prevent small tasks from becoming crises. Self-discipline grows because the person knows exactly what needs to be done. This clarity generates mental clarity that reduces stress. Over time, they begin seeing themselves as organized, creating a subtle identity shift. Practicing these rituals becomes consistent action, and inner control strengthens without effort. The mentor always says that systems reduce dependence on motivation, which is volatile and unstable. He says, motivation starts you, system keeps you. This principle makes self-discipline lighter and more sustainable. The defined path increases mental clarity, and with that clarity, a deep identity shift forms. That new identity turns consistent action into a natural rhythm. Inner control then becomes the natural state of someone who has structure. And as always, he leaves the message that understanding systems is only half the transformation. Because once behaviors are repeated inside these systems, something enormous begins to grow, the compound effect of discipline. And that's exactly what he reveals in the next topic. He always explains that the compound effect is one of the most underestimated forces in life. Small decisions seem insignificant in the moment, but when repeated daily, they completely reshape a person's destiny. He says self-discipline works like interest over interest. The more you practice it, the more emotional, physical, and mental return you generate. This constant repetition creates a mental clarity that allows you to see progress where before there was only doubt. And it's in this process that a powerful identity shift is born, one molded by consistency. The mentor reminds people that the compound effect works for good and for bad. Being 1% worse each day leads to collapse, while being 1% better leads upward. Understanding this awakens self-discipline because the person realizes that every choice matters. This understanding creates mental clarity about the impact of microactions. With this awareness, a deep identity shift begins. The person understands they are responsible for their future, and that mindset fuels consistent action and strengthens inner control. He uses real examples, like reading just 5 pages a day. 5 pages seem small, but in a month, that's over 150 pages, enough to finish a book that once felt impossible. This habit shows that self-discipline doesn't need to be massive to be powerful. It just needs to be continuous. Reading regularly expands mental clarity because the brain becomes more attentive. This cycle reinforces the identity shift of someone who grows daily. And in time, reading becomes natural consistent action that builds inner control. He also shows how small financial decisions accumulate. Investing a symbolic amount every month, even 30, 50, or 100 reais, grows into something meaningful over time. He explains that financial self-discipline is the foundation of this process. And when the person sees the graph rise, their mental clarity about money increases. This sparks a financial identity shift, where they see themselves as someone who builds wealth. This new identity strengthens consistent action, and inner control grows alongside it. He reinforces that the compound effect isn't about the size of the action, but the frequency. He often says, it's not how much you do today, it's how much you can repeat tomorrow. This mindset removes pressure and strengthens self-discipline. With this lightness, the person gains mental clarity because they no longer feel overwhelmed. This clarity creates a powerful identity shift, and repeating these small wins becomes stable, consistent action that builds inner control. He also uses physical examples, like doing just 10 push-ups a day. In a month, that's 300 push-ups, more than many people do in a year. He shows that self-discipline comes from repetition, not intensity. Daily practice creates bodily mental clarity as the body adapts. This understanding forms a physical identity shift. The person begins seeing themselves as someone who takes care of their body, and that vision fuels consistent action. Over time, inner control becomes part of their physical identity. He says the compound effect is silent. In the beginning, no one sees results. But after weeks and months, everything aligns suddenly. That's when self-discipline becomes solid. The mind receives a wave of mental clarity, realizing that progress is inevitable for those who repeat the right things daily. This revelation creates a definitive identity shift. And from that, consistent action becomes a lifestyle. This consistency anchors inner control at deep levels. He always says the compound effect rewards those who don't quit. It's like planting seeds. Digging up the soil the next day to check progress doesn't help. You must trust the process. This trust builds emotional self-discipline. The person stops demanding immediate results and starts cultivating patience. That patience brings mental clarity free from anxiety. This maturity creates a stable identity shift. And while the person keeps acting, stronger consistent action forms. Inner control then shapes their expectations and resilience. He also warns that the compound effect destroys the life of those who ignore small negative habits. He talks about addictions, distractions, impulsive spending, and procrastination. Every small slip feels harmless, but accumulates into an avalanche. When someone realizes this, their self-discipline awakens out of necessity. This awareness creates a tough but essential mental clarity. That clarity triggers an identity shift, pulling them back toward the right path. Correcting these errors becomes consistent action, and inner control overcomes self-sabotage. And he concludes by explaining that understanding the compound effect is understanding the true power of time. When the person discovers that small actions change everything, they realize they're not late, they're just beginning. And that prepares the perfect ground for the next topic, where he reveals why starting small is actually the smartest strategy for creating momentum and changing your life. He always explains that starting small isn't a sign of weakness. It's the strategy of someone who understands how the human brain works. When a person takes tiny steps, they reduce the internal resistance that usually sabotages progress. This strengthens self-discipline because the beginning no longer feels like an impossible mountain. These small movements generate mental clarity as progress becomes visible. And over time, the individual experiences a natural identity shift, seeing themselves as someone who takes action. The mentor says the mind loves extremes, do everything or do nothing. But extremes are the enemies of consistency. He shows that doing something for just 2 minutes is already enough to break the initial barrier. This simplicity strengthens self-discipline because the person completes something they promised themselves. That completion brings emotional mental clarity, reducing self-criticism. And when repeated, it becomes consistent action. That's how inner control begins to surface. He gives real examples, like reading just 1 page a day. 1 page seems ridiculous, and that's exactly why it works. The person has no excuse to avoid it. They read, they complete, and they feel reliable to themselves. This strengthens self-discipline and increases their mental clarity. Slowly, they undergo an identity shift, seeing themselves as a reader. That new identity makes consistent action natural and feeds their inner control. He also talks about physical training. Instead of attempting an hour-long workout, he suggests 5 minutes a day. 5 minutes change everything because they break the "I don't have time" excuse. This allows self-discipline to settle in effortlessly. The person feels mental clarity as they realize progress is possible even in small doses. This initiates a physical and mental identity shift. Repeating this builds consistent action and strengthens physical inner control. The mentor reinforces that small steps create psychological momentum. The mind loves quick victories. When someone wins early, that victory ignites real motivation, not imaginary motivation. This increases self-discipline because the person wants to keep feeling that progress. Their mental clarity grows because they finally see the path. This understanding builds a subtle but powerful identity shift. and that momentum becomes consistent action that strengthens inner control. He also explains that starting small eliminates fear. Big goals intimidate. Small goals invite participation. He shows that fear decreases dramatically when the person realizes they only need to take a simple action. This understanding strengthens self-discipline. The feeling of "I can do this" produces liberating mental clarity. That clarity begins shaping the identity shift. Repeating the process forms consistent action, and inner control grows as a natural outcome, not a forced one. He uses a metaphor. It's easier to push a car that's already moving than one that's standing still. He compares this to life. Starting small sets the car in motion. After that, every extra push feels lighter. That initial movement strengthens self-discipline. The person feels mental clarity when they realize they don't need perfection, only motion. That understanding fuels identity shift, and consistent repetition becomes consistent action, building stable inner control. He suggests practical strategies, like leaving books around the house, placing a water bottle on the desk, or beginning a workout simply by putting on shoes. These microactions reduce friction. They strengthen self-discipline by nudging the person forward. The mind gains mental clarity from seeing how simple the process can be. This brings the desired identity shift closer, and over time, these microstructures become consistent action. Inner control then becomes inevitable. He reminds them that starting small does not mean staying small. It's only the first chapter. Each repetition builds inner confidence, which is the fuel of self-discipline. When someone sees they can keep small promises, their mental clarity grows, and their decisions become aligned. This alignment creates a deep identity shift, and as they move forward, they build mature, consistent action. This strengthens inner control at every level of their life. And as always, he hints that starting small is only the beginning of expansion. Because once someone creates momentum, the natural next step is to shape their environment and stack new habits. And that leads perfectly into the next topic, where he shows how to transform tiny behaviors into powerful structures that shape an entire routine. He always explains that stacking habits is like building a staircase. Each step is small, but together they take you much higher than you expected. The mentor shows that the brain loves associations, so connecting a new habit to an existing one makes self-discipline easier. This strategy reduces mental resistance and makes change feel natural. As this structure repeats, a powerful mental clarity emerges. This clarity initiates an identity shift that transforms who the person is becoming. He gives simple, highly applicable examples, like reading while having coffee. Coffee is already an automatic habit. Adding reading makes the brain accept the new behavior with less resistance. This pairing reinforces daily self-discipline. The person starts seeing real progress, increasing their mental clarity about their own growth. This process lights a strong identity shift, shaping someone who learns every day. And repeating this ritual becomes consistent action that builds inner control. Another example he loves is doing one push-up after brushing your teeth. It sounds silly, but this psychological hook creates an automatic association. Self-discipline strengthens because the brain doesn't have to decide. It just executes. This simplicity creates mental clarity because it reduces internal chaos. Repetition makes the person see themselves as someone who cares for their body, creating a healthy identity shift. And with time, that becomes consistent action that builds physical inner control. He says shaping the environment is like hacking your own behavior. If someone wants to read more, they should leave books visible, on the table, bed, couch, anywhere. This removes friction and strengthens self-discipline. The mind gains mental clarity when it sees positive cues everywhere. This new atmosphere creates an identity shift aligned with growth. That environment makes consistent action easier. And inner control grows as the external world begins supporting the internal one. The mentor warns that the environment can be either your ally or your enemy. A messy home creates anxiety. A room full of distractions destroys focus. He teaches people to clean their space, like they clean their mind. This process increases self-discipline almost automatically. A clean environment generates immediate mental clarity. Over time, the person begins seeing themselves as organized, forming a conscious identity shift. Maintaining this order becomes consistent action, and inner control strengthens as the external order sustains the internal. He also talks about food. If someone wants to eat well, they should put the healthy choices in front and hide, or not buy, the harmful ones. This is how the environment shapes decisions. This trains self-discipline without suffering. Mental clarity grows when the person notices they're making smarter decisions effortlessly. This creates an identity shift towards someone who takes care of themselves. Repetition turns these choices into consistent action, and this consistency creates nutritional inner control. He explains that our digital environment is just as important. Silencing notifications, keeping the phone away during work, or deleting useless apps reduces distractions drastically. This digital cleansing strengthens self-discipline. The mind breathes and gains mental clarity. This mental peace creates an identity shift because the person begins seeing themselves as someone focused. The optimized digital routine becomes daily consistent action, and this builds a deep inner control over attention. He teaches that stacking habits creates momentum, an energy that pushes someone forward even without motivation. This accumulation turns self-discipline into something organic. Each connected habit clears the mind a little more, expanding mental clarity. The person starts acting like a disciplined individual. This is the true identity shift. And as habits unite, consistent action forms naturally. Inner control then becomes a stable foundation for the new life being built. He uses the metaphor of a train. At the beginning, it moves slowly, but once it gains speed, stopping becomes harder than continuing. Habit stacking works the same way. That speed strengthens self-discipline every day. The clarity from that movement amplifies mental clarity inside. This transformation builds an identity shift that alters the person's automatic behavior, and that accelerating rhythm becomes consistent action. Inner control stabilizes and expands. And as always, he makes it clear that stacking habits and shaping the environment creates a solid foundation. But to accelerate transformation, one more element is needed: tracking, measuring, and celebrating progress. And that's exactly what he reveals in the next topic. He always says that what gets measured improves, and what doesn't gets lost in imagination. When someone starts tracking their habits, they build self-discipline because progress becomes visible instead of imaginary. This visibility creates powerful mental clarity, revealing patterns that were previously hidden. It's like turning on a flashlight inside their routine. And this awareness initiates an identity shift where the person sees themselves as someone disciplined. The mentor encourages using simple tools like HabitNow, Loop Habit Tracker, or even a paper calendar on the wall. Technology doesn't matter, commitment does. Marking an X on the calendar creates a small victory that strengthens self-discipline. This repeated act brings mental clarity because the person sees real movement. Every mark reinforces an identity shift, the identity of someone who keeps promises. Over time, this forms consistent action and expands inner control. He explains that celebrating small wins is essential, even though most people neglect it. The brain needs rewards to consolidate new behaviors. Celebrating a workout, finishing a chapter, or saving a small amount of money reinforces self-discipline emotionally. These celebrations create mental clarity because the brain starts associating discipline with pleasure instead of pain. This accelerates identity shift. And repeating this emotional cycle strengthens consistent action and inner control. He says tracking progress prevents a destructive illusion, the belief that nothing is changing. When someone sees their records, they realize growth is constant, even on bad days. This brings emotional self-discipline because it validates the effort instead of punishing it. The data creates mental clarity by separating feelings from facts. That clarity produces a mature identity shift, and the ongoing process becomes consistent action. Over time, inner control becomes stable and reliable. The mentor shows that tracking progress protects people from collapsing after small setbacks. When a person sees long-term consistency, one bad day loses its power. This preserves self-discipline from emotional sabotage. The written record brings mental clarity, showing that the bigger picture is stronger than any isolated slip. This builds a resilient identity shift. and continuity becomes consistent action. That emotional stability deepens inner control. He insists that celebrating progress is not vanity, it's strategy. Recognizing milestones creates internal energy that fuels the next step. This energy strengthens self-discipline naturally. The clarity of progress intensifies mental clarity, and that inspiration completes the identity shift of someone who honors their journey. Over time, these rituals of recognition transform into consistent action, and this prepares the person for the next revelation. That discipline, far from being a prison, is actually the greatest form of freedom. He always says that discipline isn't prison, it's freedom in its purest form. Most people fear routine because they think it restricts life, when in reality, the lack of self-discipline is what creates chaos, anxiety, and stagnation. When someone commits to consistent choices, freedom appears as a natural consequence. This consistency frees the mind, creating mental clarity that cuts through fear and indecision. And this clarity begins a deep identity shift. The person stops being a victim of circumstances and becomes the author of their own story. The mentor likes to provoke. Those who try to choose everything end up controlling nothing. Those who choose less end up controlling more. He shows that reducing unnecessary choices strengthens self-discipline and simplifies life. This simplicity produces incredible mental clarity by removing mental noise. And with that clarity, opportunities become visible again. This perception creates an identity shift that transforms behavior. Repeating these choices becomes consistent action, reinforcing inner control. He emphasizes that discipline builds financial freedom. A person who follows a simple budget, avoids impulse spending, and invests consistently has far more autonomy than someone drowning in debt. This behavior is fueled by self-discipline and generates solid mental clarity about money. When the person realizes they control their financial life, they experience a powerful identity shift. This new identity drives consistent action naturally, and inner control becomes a source of safety and peace. He shows that discipline also frees people emotionally. When a person controls their impulses, they escape cycles of regret and self-sabotage. This emotional self-discipline creates mental clarity that reduces conflict and internal noise. Decisions become lighter and more aligned. This state produces an identity shift where the person recognizes themselves as centered and mature. And this behavior shapes consistent action. The result is a deep, long-lasting inner control. The mentor says discipline eliminates regret. He often repeats, "The price of discipline hurts now. The price of indiscipline hurts forever." Understanding this makes self-discipline grow even during challenging moments. The person gains mental clarity that only comes from seeing the long-term consequences of their choices. This creates a mature identity shift, grounded in responsibility, and aligning behaviors over time becomes consistent action. Inner control becomes a signature of someone who lives with purpose. And he ends this topic with a powerful truth. Discipline is the key to autonomy. When someone controls their habits, their body, their money, and their mind, they finally become free to choose the life they want. This freedom is born from repeated self-discipline. The clarity of this path builds constant mental clarity, and that clarity shapes an identity shift that changes everything. He leaves the feeling that if discipline sets you free, the next step is to understand that the future is built through today's choices, which is exactly what he explores in the final topic. He always says that the future isn't a distant place. It's being built in this exact moment. Every choice someone makes today shapes who they will become tomorrow. That's why self-discipline is essential. It's the bridge between who the person is and who they want to be. When they understand this, their mental clarity expands because they see that power never existed in tomorrow. It always existed in the present. And this realization begins an immediate identity shift where action becomes identity. The mentor reinforces that there's no ideal moment to begin. There's only the moment someone chooses. He shows that those who wait stay stuck, but those who move, even lightly, ignite massive internal change. This movement strengthens self-discipline and brings transformative mental clarity. The person starts seeing opportunities where they once saw walls. This shift sparks a strong identity shift, and once repeated, It becomes consistent action, guided by inner control. He reminds them that tiny decisions today can drastically shape their future. Reading a little daily, saving a small amount, training for 10 minutes, practicing one new skill. These seeds grow with time. Growth born from self-discipline compounds quietly. And as these actions repeat, mental clarity deepens, revealing a more defined path. This understanding builds an unshakable identity shift. And from this identity, consistent action becomes a natural part of life, strengthening inner control consistently. He likes to say that the future responds to the present like an echo. What you send today comes back multiplied tomorrow. If someone lives on autopilot, they get chaos. If they live with intention, they get progress. This truth awakens self-discipline because it shows that cause always precedes effect. This insight brings sharp mental clarity, removing distractions. Identity shift becomes visible when the person finally acts like the protagonist of their life. And the repetition of these aligned decisions becomes consistent action. Inner control grows as doubt loses power. The mentor teaches that building the future doesn't require speed. It requires direction. Moving slowly is still moving. Consistent action, even tiny, builds internal confidence, the fuel of self-discipline. When someone feels they can honor small promises, their mental clarity increases, aligning their choices. This alignment creates a deep and stable identity shift. Over time, these movements form mature, consistent action, and inner control becomes a grounded, daily force. He ends by leaving a simple but powerful truth in the air. Tomorrow is only a reflection of today's decisions. Those who act now transform. Those who delay repeat. This realization activates self-discipline permanently. It brings the mental clarity needed to take the next step, and it triggers the final identity shift, the shift of someone who takes responsibility for the life they want. From this point forward, consistent action becomes the natural path, and inner control becomes the foundation of every future they build. Now that you understand the root of your strength, the real question is simple. What are you going to do with it? Every transformation begins the moment you decide to act, not when you merely imagine. Your future depends on the small choices you make when nobody is watching, and it's in those exact moments that self-discipline proves itself. This is your chance to decide which version of you wins today. Because in the end, the one who changes your life is you. Not motivation, not chance, not luck. If you truly want to flip the switch, start applying everything you learned here today. Choose one habit, one movement, one micro-commitment, and execute. Prove to yourself that you can take the first step even without wanting to. That simple decision creates powerful mental clarity and activates the identity shift you've postponed for years. Deep down, you already know what you need to do. You just need to start. Before you leave, ask yourself silently, are you really going to walk away from this video and return to the habits that are destroying you? Or are you finally going to act like someone who knows they deserve more? This question is uncomfortable, and that's exactly why it works. It pushes you toward consistent action and toward the inner control you know you must build. Change won't knock on your door. It's waiting for you to knock on its. And here's the final truth. If you leave now, you go back to autopilot. But if you stay on this channel, I guarantee, you will never think the same again. Here, every video is a weapon against your old identity. Every video is another brick in the construction of your new self. So subscribe right now, activate notifications, and join the small percentage who truly decides to evolve. Don't do this for me. Do it for you, for the life that's waiting on your courage.